Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another Hearts of Iron 4 alternate history video. Moonbeam also says hello. Say hi, Moonbeam. Yes. Lots of kisses. I've been trying to get another one of these recorded before it is that I leave for Peru, which is literally tomorrow at the time that I'm making this. And from my Ottoman video, by an overwhelming margin, you all wanted to see what would happen if the Allies would declare war on the USSR after the Poland partition. Well, my friends, let's go ahead and dive in. Considering that we're talking about things from an Allied perspective here, that means that we're going to approach things from the position of the United Kingdom. It's a question that a number of people often have in history of why exactly did the Allies not declare on the Soviet Union after it is that they invaded Poland? After all, considering the wars that were going on in this time period, Germany wasn't the only aggressor. Still, there's a very key reason as to why it didn't happen, and we're going to go ahead and talk about that. There are a multitude of reasons as to why the early opening stages of the war were, well, they didn't exactly go very well for the Allies. The UK actually had far more plans to interfere with Germany. The reason as to why it didn't really happen is because, well, France kind of capitulated way too fast. No one expected that in a matter of 6 weeks, the war for the entirety of Western Europe would be over. This is one of the key reasons as to why the UK never really did anything to stand against the Soviet Union, because there's no way that the UK on its own, with France having been wiped out, was actually going to be able to do anything against the Soviets. This is also one of the key reasons as to why they did not intervene in the Winter War. There was actually a plan to send around 100,000 men, as well as a whole bunch of planes, equipment, and everything that you can think of to Finland to help in their war, the Winter War against the Soviets. But it did not happen because, well, they ended up being way more occupied by events over here. Also, in addition to this plan, was an idea from it that they would invade Norway and be able to seize the northern iron mines, like this very resource-rich area here of Sweden, from which Germany was getting all of its steel and its goods that it needed to fuel its war machine. Well, besides oil, of course. Like, they still would have lacked oil and everything else, but the highest quality steel utilized by German arms manufacturers for all their tanks, for their weaponry, a lot of this was coming from Sweden. So by taking over this territory, it would have dealt a massive blow to the German arms industry. That is actually one of the precise reasons as to why Germany invaded Norway in the first place. Not because it hated Norway, but because it needed to be able to secure its trade with Sweden, and it didn't want the Allies to be able to intervene and stop that. Still, I haven't answered the question then of, well, what would happen in the event that the UK declared war on the Soviet Union after the partition of Poland? The issue is, answering this also goes hand in hand with what I just spoke about with Finland and everything else. Literally everything is tied together in a kind of domino effect. So in order for us to change what happens with Poland, we're going to have to change what happens with, well, the beginning of World War II. To that end, things are basically going to follow the same kind of pattern that they did in our own timeline, at least for the beginning. Britain is not going to try to stop Germany. During this time, it and France are both going to pursue the path of appeasement. France really can't do anything on its own without the support of the UK, and the UK has no wish to enter into a war. There is actually a fantastic video series on here by Call Me Ezekiel, who is a history YouTuber that I would strongly recommend for specifically history on the whole appeasement period and why it is that this happened. A lot of people give the UK shit during this time of like, oh, why didn't they stand up to Germany? The short of it was because it didn't feel that it could. The military had basically been gutted after World War I, and with the whole thing of the Great Depression that swept through the entirety of the world, the UK had rapidly demobilized over the interwar period, and it just couldn't militarily intervene. It needed a good 3, 4, 5 years to actually prepare itself, mobilize itself, and be ready to send its men to the front line. It needed that time. So that is precisely what we're going to end up doing. The early years are spent building up the UK's industry and preparing it for potentially a coming conflict. There's a lot of tension during this time, specifically after 1935. Unlike previous examples of what ifs, we don't actually have to do anything to change the industrial base of Britain from the very beginning. It pretty much was in that same kind of position. It's just for this scenario, we're going to need to change its choices that it makes, as well as perhaps some outcomes in the actual outbreak of the war. So in order to prepare for this possibility of intervening, let's say that from the very beginning, at the very start of 1936, the UK begins a limited series of not reforms, but specifically measures to rearm itself, boost back up its industries. Besides this slight change in focus, pretty much every single thing that would occur in our historical timeline is going to occur in this one. King George V would still die. This would lead to the rise of Edward VIII, who is his own interesting figure in the first place, we should say. And of course, this still means that we're going to have events like the remilitarization of the Rhine. Several German divisions recently advanced into the Rhineland, marking the first time since the end of the Great War the Germany forces positioned west of the Rhine. This is a clear violation of the Versailles Treaty, under which Germany is forbidden from militarizing the region. Which, yes, it is going to do this. We issue a objection. And the French, of course, back down. They're not going to do anything. This still happens. It is an interesting alternate history question of what if they hadn't done this? What if they had actually gone to war? But there's a whole bunch of reasons as to why that is likely to go very, very wrong and spins off into many different directions. But despite the rearmament, the British are steady as she goes. The mounting crisis is precisely why we must remain true to our roots. We will continue the course that we have sailed in recent years, rather than make any drastic political changes that may cause internal instability when we can least afford it. Indeed. From this choice, we are presented with two options, going with global defense or home defense. Global defense would be the alternate history in which we do not actually go down a path of appeasement. Instead, what ends up happening is the UK takes a stand against Germany earlier and actually actively intervenes in all the varying different movements around the world. That is a fascinating alternate history. But what we are going to be doing is home defense. Still, it does not mean that the UK has to focus on this at the time. Instead, the large focus is going to be dedicated specifically towards rearmament and reinforcing the empire. And just as in our timeline, Edward VIII would still have to face his whole abdication crisis. He would want to marry Wallis Simpson, which is a thing that I've actually addressed when doing stuff for a regular gaming video. But in this case, we're going to follow the historical timeline in which, he gives up his throne for love. How cute. So yes, King Edward will abdicate, and this gives us George VI, who is a significantly more popular figurehead. Yes, God save the king. And so yes, while the UK can't necessarily intervene directly in anything yet, it will still do things like embargoing Italy. It will try to utilize its economic power, just as it did in our timeline, in order to be able to limit the activities of others. Of course, we all know nothing really worked. It is here in early 1936 that the UK really begins to organize itself around the idea of being able to produce equipment in order to resist the Axis powers. The Shadow Scheme is launched, in which the Air Ministry has come up with a brilliant suggestion for easier conversion of civilian factories into military ones. With the appropriate grants and loans to various key companies, their factories can extend and adapt in advance to make the transition to military applications much smoother. Of course, by mid-1937, this is what brings us to the true point of appeasement for the UK, when Stanley Baldwin would go and retire. 2 weeks after the coronation of King George VI, Mr. Baldwin has announced that he will resign the premiership in order to retire at the age of 70. Having led the national government on and off since 1923, he has been the steady hand responsible for bringing the British Empire out of the Great Depression, and in recent years has reluctantly overseen the beginning of imperial rearmament and the abdication of King Edward VIII. He steps down as a popular and successful prime minister, but has he done enough to continue, or to counter rather, the growing threat from Germany? Yes. This brings us Chamberlain, the appeaser. Just as in our own timeline, the UK during this would primarily focus on building its Commonwealth ties, and specifically try to get an alliance together in order to be able to combat against growing German aggression. It's not just that though. In this time period, what is fascinating is that the UK and Italy were actually in talks for quite a while in order to be able to get, say, Italy to side with the Allies against Germany. That is a real thing that could have happened, but it didn't because, well, Italy saw more benefits in siding with the Axis, but there were negotiations. Fascinating alternate history what if. Of course, France is still going to join the Allies. All of that is still going to work exactly as it did in our own timeline. So it is that the British Empire in this time will begin to rapidly rearm. At least as much as it possibly can with the limited time that it has. It is starting to look like another great war is inevitable, but if it isn't Hitler, it will be the Mikado or even the Soviets. Public opinion has swung enough that we can initiate a program of general rearmament. As 1938 rolls into 1939, this is the point in which the UK really begins to prepare its home defenses. It is trying to prepare its public for when it goes to war, but at this point, not necessarily prepare for a direct intervention. That is not what is happening yet at this point. Still though, it's important to prepare for the inevitable. This is because we're going to see events like the Munich Conference and dealing with Sudetenland. Unfortunately, just as in our own timeline, the Czechs are going to have to be sacrificed. The UK still needs more time. With the complete fall of Czechoslovakia, it would become painfully apparent that appeasement policies were not working anymore. Peace in our time was not true. So it is, in August of 1939, that war breaks out. The German Reich goes and invades Poland, France and the United Kingdom join in on the conflict, and yet, just as in our original timeline, they don't do anything to help. France launches no strikes, the UK doesn't do anything, sends over no expeditionary forces. Instead, it bides its time until Germany takes its own initiative. At the time that this happens, of course, the Soviets are still going to launch their winter war against Finland. And it is here that finally our alternate history scenario truly begins. The USSR goes and occupies eastern Poland. Soviet troops have occupied eastern Poland officially for the purpose of protecting Belarusian and Ukrainian minorities from the chaos that followed the collapse of the Polish government. German forces have withdrawn these areas in good order, resulting in Poland's effective partitioning between two powers. Even though it is possible maybe, that the UK and France would declare war on the Soviet Union at this time, they're not going to. For anyone who's going to make an argument in the comment section saying, oh, but they had a treaty of defense with Poland. Yes, but that treaty specifically was a defensive treaty against Germany. That was the specific wording of it. The Soviet Union was never included in this treaty for the purpose of defense. Naturally, over the course of the war and after the war, this would leave a very bad taste in Polish people's mouth and lead to a lot of anger, but that's the way that the cookie kind of crumbled. So, the argument that we're going to make in this new timeline of what it is that the UK does is, although they do not immediately interfere, although they don't immediately declare war on the Soviet Union, they do look for opportunities to specifically support people against them and eventually take this as an opportunity to actually declare war. Namely by guaranteeing Finland. Negotiations have already broke down between the Finns and the Soviet Union, and so it would make sense in this context from the scenario that we have built that although the treaty that was developed with the Polish did not result in action, this, technically speaking, could. Why would this happen, though? Well, the argument that we're going to make is that, unlike what happened in our own timeline, in which France fell very rapidly in the span of like 6 weeks, France is actually going to hold out for a decently longer amount of time here. Instead of weeks, perhaps it is 6 months, which may not sound like a lot, but that is actually a big difference. It means 6 months in which the Germans are bleeding out more men. It means 6 months in which additional supplies are able to be sent out to more areas. It is a big time frame that we are talking about here. And so those supplies, the 100,000 men, all the aircraft, everything that I meant to talk about here before, all of that is actually sent to Finland in this new timeline. The UK agrees to support them. Welcome to the Allies, Finland. Chamberlain would, of course, resign during this time, and Winston Churchill would take charge. With the war developing to the detriment of us and our allies, the Prime Minister has come under fire for both his peacetime and wartime decisions at critical junctions. At a moment when Britain needs to stand united more than ever, it finds itself divided as portions of the Parliament hold Chamberlain in contempt. Lacking vital support from Labour, the Prime Minister has made the decision to resign, favouring Lord Halifax as replacement. However, Halifax has been sceptical, and Chamberlain has advised the King to call upon Winston Churchill. Churchill, who had long warned of the war was now upon us, is believed to be capable of leading us through it. Amazingly, just in time, enough British help is able to arrive in Finland that specifically it is able to help turn the tides. The Finns were performing remarkably well against the Soviets over the course of the Finnish War, The Finns were performing remarkably well against the Soviets over the course of the Winter War. It was something that, even outnumbered 10 or 20 to 1, they were taking significantly less losses than what they were inflicting upon them, with much more basic equipment. With massive amounts of arms flooding into the country, as well as additional aircraft to provide some support against the enemy, Finland is actually able to hold the line in this timeline. Of course, what we're talking about is entirely dependent upon the French actually performing better in war. One of the key reasons that the Germans have been so effective is because they were utilizing impressively good combined arms tactics. They were combining very well their aircraft along with ground troops for coordinated strikes. So theoretically, if this is something that the UK had invested more time and energy into its air force to be able to compete, theoretically this means that it would be able to combat Germany in a more equal measure. Of course, this is also assuming that France, which actually had a fairly large aviation industry, actually combined and consolidated it instead of having all of these tiny little companies competing with one another that ultimately were not able to be used right up until the war broke out, by which case most of the designs were mismatched. By June of 1940, the French have actually managed to hold against the Germans. Efforts to invade the country using lightning-fast blitzkrieg tactics have largely failed, and with an increased presence of British forces instead of a smaller British expeditionary force, this has actually managed to hold the line somewhat. Historically, in our timeline, Italy would declare war upon France and the Allies, specifically trying to take part in the action after Germany had made rapid gains against the French. They didn't want to be left out from the spoils of war. In this timeline, though, they likely would have held off for a little bit longer as the Germans would not have made more ground, which in turn would mean that Adolf would have to put significantly more pressure upon Mussolini to try and open up a second front and war France from the south. This would have the much desired effect, as French forces would have to be pulled off the front line against the Germans in order to be moved south to protect against the Italians. Unlike our own timeline, in which the French had completely collapsed by June, heading into fall of 1940, they would have been able to hold on here. With the influx of Italian troops flooding into the southern country, though, this would have severely weakened their position, and gradually the country would still fall. There is really nothing that can be done about that. Even assuming significantly greater competence, it's still not going to work out in their favor. That being said, because the majority of Italian forces would be occupied specifically trying to launch their own invasion into France, which is more competent in this timeline, simultaneously that means that the North African front, though initially they would be able to push against the British, would face significantly harder consequences because the British would be able to rally massive numbers of colonial troops and then push into Italian Libya. With Italian forces spread so thin, it means that their Eastern African colonies would be very quickly swept up, allowing the Ethiopian state to once again come back. In this new timeline that we've created, it is not June of 1940 in which France falls, it is June of 1941. 6 months to a year later, and with perhaps the cost of hundreds of thousands or potentially even 1 million German lives, the Germans have paid dearly in order to defeat France. Unfortunately for England, in this timeline, there really would be no stopping the German Reich, not with the way that we have set up the scenario. The difference is in here, the Winter War would still be ongoing, with additional British support and the majority of the Finnish population drafted into the fight, plus additional resources coming in from England as well as French exiles. This means, in the scenario, that the Soviet Union is simply not able to break through until bringing in massive numbers of potential tanks, planes, and also infrastructure construction. It is by this time in our original timeline that the German Reich would have launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, and theoretically they would be tempted to do so right now as the Soviets are still heavily distracted with Finland, which is receiving all kinds of support from England. However, they're not going to do this. Because of the scenario that we built, we had to make a more competent France, which means hundreds of thousands or potentially even millions of Germans bled out in order to take it, and they're simply not going to have the manpower, the resources, the equipment, anything, because all of this would have been spent trying to take out the French. Effectively, the war would draw into a kind of stalemate. The British would have spent massive amounts of resources in order to support both sides, and it simply would not be able to spare more resources in order to be able to try and retake the mainland. It was stuck. Of course, Japan was still going to do what Japan did best, and stir up trouble. This would mean, in this new timeline, America still joins. It is interesting to note in this timeline that the Germans never would have had the manpower to be able to invade Norway, meaning that even with limited resources, as long as the UK is receiving funding from the United States, along with additional manpower and perhaps equipment, they would be able to launch their own kind of intervention to try and seize the iron mines of Sweden. With American along with Commonwealth forces being able to launch a strike into northern Africa, which was largely able to be taken already, the last remaining vestiges of Italian control would be seized. With German and Italian forces desperately trying to hold out in the south, there would be very little manpower to spare to stop an English combined strike in order to take out Sweden. From doing so, a puppet government would very quickly be set up, which would forbid any kind of trade with the German Reich. Meaning, the greatest supply of steel, along with perhaps tungsten and multiple other goods, all of this would have been wiped out instantly. The German war machine would be crippled. So now here we are with the German Reich having conquered France. They have no good source of steel. They do not have a source of oil unless they are trading it with the Soviets. They are missing key goods. The only place that they can really get that in a large and sufficient quantity now is going to be the Soviet Union. That means after approximately a year of recovery, Germany finally marches east. As the Soviet Union by this time would have been fighting for years against Finland, which is continuously being propped up by the Allies, this means that hundreds of thousands, potentially even millions of Soviet lives have bled in the frozen north. While this arguably would be a great training experience for them, simultaneously it would severely weaken them, as massively valuable resources that could have been used to stop the Germans, though they would be in a weaker position themselves, are no longer there. As the German invasion meets the Finnish counterattack, this in turn would result in additional casualties. Now the Finns would actually be placed on the back foot and forced to retreat to their own territory. The Germans would still have severely underestimated the Soviet Union, which would not collapse no matter how much difficulty it was facing here. Yes, it is probable in this timeline that they would be able to catch Moscow, considering just how much the Soviets are being pressed from more sides than they had initially anticipated. However, it doesn't mean that they are going to collapse, and as the Germans push further and further and further into the east, it's going to lead to significantly more attrition. With significantly reduced forces, this is going to allow the Allies to launch their operations and attacks into Italy. In striking the southern border, the Germans simply cannot spare the troops, as every single spare man has to be sent to the east. Moscow has fallen Stalin. Stalingrad has not yet, but for whatever reason, the Soviets do not give up. Considering how weakened the British are likely by this time, they do not have the resources to be able to launch major strikes, but potentially by late 1943 going into 44, the Italian Civil War will have broken out and Italy would have flipped. The difference here, though, is that Germany would have expended significantly more of its resources, meaning it cannot pull troops from the east in order to be able to stop the fall of the South. And as Turkey joins the Allies, this means that things begin to crumble for Germany. Over the span of months, France is subsequently freed, with additional strikes likely being launched from the north, which in turn would allow Germany to be completely enveloped. Their forces would be spread far too thin, with millions having been lost in the Soviet invasion, and the Soviet Union in this position not really able to capitalize. It too would have bled out millions, both in its fight against Finland, not having any lend-lease of any kind of form from the Allies. The United States would not have been supplying them at all in this time, and instead, Germany would gradually begin to collapse. Ultimately, when we're talking about this scenario, much of it is perhaps wishful thinking on my part. There is no guarantee that the Finns would actually be able to hold against the Soviets. There is no guarantee that the Soviets would not try to achieve some degree of peace with the Finns, and this in turn would allow them to focus on the Germans. Subsequently, after the war, all sides would have likely been too exhausted to be able to continue. Whether or not it means that we once again see the rise of an Iron Curtain, a communist East in the move of the German Eastern collapse, we do not know. If the varying different powers had been significantly more successful in containing the Soviet Union and Germany, then yes, we would have been able to see Allied democratic forces take over Poland and much of Eastern Europe. But this alternate history is perhaps wishful thinking on my part. I don't know. Either way, I think we are here at the end of this video. I know that I haven't played this scenario out completely in order to be able to go to the peace deal, but at this point in time, I have to go to bed. I leave for my flight in the span of like 7 hours. I have to get this done. I ask that for all of you watching, please make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and make sure to go ahead and put a comment in the comment section below that specifically has your next what if scenario. I will be taking suggestions from the comment section there, and I will go and put that up on a poll to determine what we're doing for the next video. Top 5 most liked comments, that's what gets put in. My friends, thank you all very much for watching. I will see you all next time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye, guys.